Opponents to GMOs often cite a number of reasons to oppose them, and specifically, they talk about the risks, those things that are unknown that could happen off in the future when we start to adopt GMOs. Some hope that labeling GMOs are going to make it so that those who wish to avoid these risks can avoid them, while others could engage in them if they really wanted to. Others hope that by just banning GMOs altogether, they can avoid these risks for everybody. But what exactly are they worried about? What are the risks? Well, the ones that are most often cited fall into two categories: food safety or environmental. First, let's talk about the food safety risks. Some believe that there might be the possibility that these foods will directly poison us. So, for example, we might introduce genes into foods, through the plants or animals that produce these foods, and those animals and plants now produce some toxin that directly harms us. That hopefully would be screened out in a food safety process, but perhaps we miss something. Some sort of food safety risk like that with a toxin could lead to kidney disease or liver disease or worse. Many cite the risk of cancer from consuming GMOs. In fact, if you search the internet, it's full of images of mice with large tumors purportedly due to consuming GMO corn or other types of GMOs. A lot are worried about genetic modifications leading to the introduction of allergens in foods that were not previously there. So perhaps we take genes from one plant and put it in another. And those who are now allergic to the original plant are going to be allergic to this modified plant and may not be aware of it. And that can cause pretty severe reactions in some individuals. Other possible risks are more indirect. So perhaps the GMO itself is not the issue, but other associated technologies. So, for example, suppose we develop a plant that resists herbicide to make weeding easier. When we do that, we then might increase the amount of herbicide that is introduced to the plants that we then eventually eat, increasing the exposure of both the farm workers and also those who consume the foods eventually. And that herbicide then may cause problems. Other risks we would classify as environmental risks. These are risks not directly from consuming the food, but they're risks that occur because of the production process and what it does to the environment around where the GMOs are produced. So GMOs, for example, may threaten an invasive species. When we develop a GMO, for example, to resist pests, it might resist the pests that we're worried about, but also threaten other species. Some have cited monarch butterflies or honeybees as being threatened by GMOs. As pests or bacterial diseases develop tolerance to the toxins in the GMOs that we've introduced, then we might be left with even worse options in the future. So the GMO itself might not be the problem, but the fact that that GMO now makes a lot of our technology useless and we have to develop or use other technologies that cause greater environmental damage in the future can cause us a problem. So for example, glyphosate, which has been used with Roundup Ready corn and soybeans, we now see an increasing amount of tolerance of weeds to glyphosate in the US. And there are now actual markets for herbicides, that are specifically designed to be used with glyphosate to attack these resistant weeds. There's also the possibility of cross-pollination. So we might have farmers who choose to grow non-GMO seed next to farmers who choose to grow with GMO seed. And of course, it's very difficult to control the wind and to try and keep pollen from spreading from one place to another. And what that means is we might actually end up with a situation where the non-GMO seed gets contaminated with GMO seed. And if that GMO seed outcompetes the non-GMO seed, we may not be left with any non-genetically modified crops to grow. There's also been a lot of worry about the technology called a gene drive. Gene drive is a way of introducing a trait in a way so that it becomes dominant. In other words, it becomes a trait that has very high probability of being passed on to offspring. And this is an interesting prospect because if we have the high enough probability of being passed on to offspring, then eventually, over generations, this trait will be represented in the entire population, even if it makes that organism less fit. In other words, more likely to die younger or to not have offspring at all. This has been proposed in ways to use in mosquitoes, for example, to try and reduce the spread of malaria or eliminate the spread of malaria. So there are a whole bunch of potential benefits, but at the same time, it has this potentially global impact. And what if we introduce the wrong type of genes using this technology? Finally, there's the possibility of monoculture and industrial agriculture. Whenever we plant a single crop on a plot, we've introduced a monoculture, and biotechnology often makes it so we are encouraging farmers to grow on larger and larger plots and to use fewer and fewer crops because these genetically modified crops are dominant. They have higher yields and they produce better profits in the long run. What that means is there's less biodiversity. And when there's less biodiversity, we become more susceptible to individual pests that might crop up that hadn't been there before, or crop diseases, or even things like drought or other stress on crops. What happens is we might actually develop something like a superweed, right? A weed that is really resistant to the types of toxins that are introduced through the genetically modified crops, and these superweeds can't be killed by our normal measures. Additionally, genetically modified crops encourage monoculture and higher scale agriculture or larger scale agriculture, which means larger farms and farms that are driven a little bit more by profit and a little bit less by stewardship of the land. This is also another worry, is just that our agriculture will become too industrialized and too corporate, if you will.